the most important issues regarding the quality assurance aspects in these difficult times of Corona. Today, we have a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Leah Matthews, Executive Director of the Distance Education Accrediting Commission, Washington, D.C., and Professor Robert Wagener from Groningen University. Robert is joining our, although actually we are joining Robert's projects for quite some time now. Robert is Director of International Tuning Academy and Professor of History and Politics of Higher Education from Groningen University. Today's topic of today's webinar is the impact on the online delivery of the achievement of the learning outcomes. And I'm very happy to have this, to be able to discuss this with you, since I think that both higher education institutions and accreditation agencies in consequence struggle with actually making sure that all those intended learning outcomes that are promised to students and to university stakeholders are achieved, and the quality assurance agencies, on the other hand, while adapting to the new mode of external quality assurance procedures, do also have to take that into account and make sure that they do evaluate achievement of those learning outcomes properly. I'm also very happy to recognize that we'll actually discuss this topic from two different perspectives, from the perspective of the higher education institution represented here by Robert, and perspective of quality assurance agency focused specifically on the online education and how to accredit to make sure that we evaluate the achievement of the learning outcomes properly. Without any further delay, I think that I would also like to thank Eva Fernandez de la Bastida for organizing the whole event and coordinating our efforts here. And I would like to invite Robert to take the floor and make your presentation.
No, we decided to change the order.
Okay, very good. So then we'll start with Leah. Okay, fair enough. Okay.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as soon as I have the ability to do so. My screen sharing is disabled. Eva, can you go ahead and give me a screen sharing capability, please? If you can't hand it over to me, feel free to go ahead and put my presentation up. All right, thank you so much. Go ahead and advance to the next slide and keep going. We'll stop right here for now. Just one back, there we go. So any model of quality assurance is going to have an impact on outcomes and outcomes assessment. And in relation to distance education, I want to talk about these categories as I see them as essential features for distance education and online learning. And all of these factors ultimately contribute to students achieving the outcomes. How we share information with students, how we design learning for them, how we manage the technology enterprise, and the students' access to the technology platforms that they need to be effective learners in an online environment is critical. So I'm going to go through these categories, and because I know most of you today are involved in some way in a quality assurance role, I'm hoping that these presentations can give you some ideas to take away into your own practice for quality assurance. So let's advance to the next slide. So information shared with students is critically important. There must be clear guidance to students where they can find all of their online course components, and this needs to be in a conspicuous location. We often make assumptions about students and their abilities to learn online because they spend so much of their life using mobile devices and other forms of technology, we have this assumption that automatically they're going to be successful in online learning. I'll tell you that's not the case if we aren't precise and deliberate about how our information is organized for students. We have to have excellent protocols in place for verifying the students and their identity, authenticating the student work, that we're very clear about costs, participation requirements, any schedules for synchronous activities, and all of these disclosures need to be made clear to the student before they finalize their commitment to the online program. Of course, in any learning setting, you want to identify the prerequisites, but again, let's be sure that we've made every effort to put this information in a very clear and conspicuous location for students online. As I just said, it's not fair to make assumptions about students and their abilities to use technology when transitioning into an online environment. Move ahead, please. Let's talk a little bit about academic quality. Instructional materials need to be in a format appropriate to online learning and that are relevant to the learning outcomes. This needs to be more than just putting students in front of PowerPoint presentations day after day after day. When there's good policies about how the format is designed for online learning and that it's consistently applied across a program and hopefully across an institution, that assures a more consistent quality experience for the student. Academics in online learning should also follow the same protocols for academic integrity and academic honesty. Students need to be held to the same expectations, whether they've been in an on-campus learning environment or an purely online learning and distance education environment. Academic services need to be in place, and faculty should have very clear plans for specific and scheduled interactions with students as they've transitioned into an online learning environment. Next slide, please. Instructional design is a critical component to effective online learning. Instructional design is a field that is burgeoning right now in the United States. Instructional designers are trained in how to take content from curriculum and put it into an online format that has variety, that has engaging activities, that encourages student peer to student peer interaction, students to faculty interaction. It has effective assessment techniques, and all of these activities, when built into an online learning environment, make for a better quality experience for the students. Instructional designers can make sure that there's a variety of different technologies. They can make sure that there's resources available, such as an online digital library or other means for students to supplement their learning and their engagement with faculty and peer-to-peer. When a well-qualified faculty member is teamed with a highly competent instructional designer, you can often experience almost a nirvana experience for students, but it takes a great deal of experience and competence in both areas to make online learning and distance education effective and to get to that penultimate goal, which is students are achieving the learning outcomes. Please move on. Next slide. Oh, technology enterprise, just let's stay right there. So for the technology enterprise, this can't be overlooked. Institutions need to make a commitment of resources to make sure that they have an effective, reliable technology enterprise, that student data and confidential information is secured and protected, that faculty receive training on the functions of the technologies and optimize their ability. You can have the most wonderfully, effectively designed technology enterprise, but if faculty haven't been trained and aren't comfortable using it and don't know how to access all of the capabilities, then it's not going to be an effective system for learners. Any digital or online teaching aids need to be reviewed on a regular basis. We recommend at least annually that faculty, administrators, instructional designers conduct a review of their technology to make sure that the learner experience can be at its optimal level. And any program that's being delivered in distance education format really should have a technology plan so that they're looking ahead to any upgrades, enhancements, software, securities that they may need to make sure that their technology platform, online program management systems are secure and effective. Next slide, please. So talking about outcomes assessment. Outcomes assessment can take place, as you know, all of you are very experienced in this arena, in many types of formats. Outcomes need to be very clearly established and measurable. At DEAC, which is the accrediting body that I operate in the United States, we are very specific about this. Learning outcomes must be measurable. They must very, very clearly state what the student is expected to achieve at an assignment level, a course level, and ultimately the program level for which they're enrolled. These competencies need to clearly describe the outcome, and they need to be appropriate to the level of the degree. They need to have sufficient academic rigor. Far too often, we see graduate programs with stated learning outcomes that don't have the rigor that we would expect for graduate level study. So looking at course, program, and even institutional level outcomes and mission, we expect to see sufficient academic rigor articulated in those outcomes. And the evaluation of student work needs to be performed by qualified faculty using clear and coherent rubrics. Often when we're doing a review and we ask to see the rubrics that faculty are using to evaluate student work, our DEAC staff sometimes can run into some resistance. So we don't need rubrics to review our student work. At DEAC, we want to better understand how those student learning outcomes are being assessed. And when there's a clear and coherent rubric that specifically states what students are expected to demonstrate in their competencies and in their outcomes, then we can be effective in our practice of quality assurance. And one other point here to make is that institutions use direct and indirect measures when they're assessing student learning, and that this is all tied in together into their outcomes assessment plan. We expect to see the features of academic quality, technology enterprise, instructional design, student support, all of these factors contributing ultimately to the learning outcome, and that there's a body of evidence that all of these features are in place and are reflected in those student learning outcomes. Continue, please, to the next slide. Back one, please. So the student outcomes must be assembled in clear and real evidence. And I would submit to you that online learning and the online learning program management systems, this technology enterprise, assembles a lot of data about how students are interacting with the platform, recording or making a record of their interactions with faculty, recording their interactions amongst each other. All of this data can assemble real evidence of student achievement. That is, if the institution knows how to use their system to its optimal levels. I think that sometimes we can have more evidence of how students are making progress through their learning outcomes based on the data that an online program management system can provide us that may be more effective than what we can assemble from students having a traditional on-ground experience. That's because there's a digital footprint of their engagement in the online learning management system. For institutions to be effective in demonstrating outcomes and student learning, they have to have a clear and coherent strategy for gathering that data, analyzing that data, and presenting the results. Without this evidence, a quality assurance body really can't make any kind of assessment about the effectiveness of that institution meeting its mission. And that comes together with a study of the student outcomes in relation to the institution's mission and its plans for future improvement. So outcomes assessment planning really comes down to 3 steps, describing the areas assessed, defining the method of assessment, and explaining how the institution utilizes and interprets these results. A well-designed learning management system, a coherent technology enterprise with faculty and administrators that know how to leverage that technology and utilize it to its optimal advantage can demonstrate very, very good and successful student learning outcomes. Continue, please. Next slide. So anytime you're evaluating an online learning program or a distance education institution, the effectiveness of their platform is only as good as the access the students have to technology. One aspect of the DEAC standards is evaluating how institutions are looking at students and their access to equipment and internet stability. If students don't have the technology access that they need, they don't have the equipment, they don't have a stable internet available to them, then it's going to deeply impact their ability to be successful as a student. A standard DEAC has is demonstrate that the institution is verifying the student can access all of this before they enroll, not after they enroll. It's really important to make sure that the student can do this online before you enroll them. And I would also say that the time for saying we're in this emergency remote delivery is past. Okay? It's been 9 months. And we finished the spring term of 2020. We're kind of limped to the end. The summer should have been spent engaging in how much resources were available to institutions to have an online fall term. But we can't be in an emergency response situation anymore. This transition to online learning has been a very real factor for 2020. And any ongoing disruptions to students at this point need to be addressed by the Quality Assurance Agency. Next slide, please. At DEAC, we have a number of resources that we are willing to share with any quality assurance body anywhere in the world. We make these openly available to the public. This is just a screenshot of DEAC's website, www.deac.org. This is a link to all of our evaluator documents and rubrics, whether it's testing an institution's initial readiness for accreditation. We have our review forms for when we look at online curriculum. These forms are used by our subject specialist. Please feel free to use any of these documents as a way to look at your own practice in quality assurance and your own role in reviewing distance education. Next slide, please. This is a free online tool that DEAC launched in partner with Higher Digital. This is a free assessment tool that an institution or program can take to kind of gauge its effectiveness in online learning. There are kind of 4 components to this little assessment test. It is a measure of technology enterprise, institutional effectiveness, responsiveness to students, and academic quality. So if you want to share this tool or take a look at it yourself, please go ahead. We've found that it's helpful to institutions that are making a transition to online learning to kind of see where they score. This assessment provides a score on kind of your effectiveness in delivering distance education around 4 key areas. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to take questions at this time or turn things over to Robert for the next part of this webinar. So just let me know if we'd like to have discussion now or our transition to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Leah. I think that it will be good to have some Q&A at the end of the webinar. So I think that, well, for me personally, it was absolutely amazing and super interesting. So I would have a couple of questions myself, but let's now move to Robert and see the perspective of the university.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, you can hear me, I suppose?
Yes, everything is fine.
Perfect. So thank you for inviting me to address this marvelous audience. And of course, a number of you I know in person anyway. We have met either in ECA meetings or otherwise, or people are probably participating in one of our projects. Indeed, I will take the perspective of the institution, and I dare to do so, although it's quite ambitious to represent Europe or higher education institutions in general in Europe. But I must admit, I have some context with other academics, of course, throughout Europe, in particular as a result also of my presidentship of the Euroculture Erasmus Joint Master degree that actually went through European accreditation last year. And I also have to be very honest that this year, for many academics, many institutions have been very challenging. Because the experience with regard to online learning still seems to be very limited in most institutions throughout Europe. So achieving ambitious and relevant learning outcomes in a COVID-19 situation is indeed challenging. But we also realize, academics as well as institutions, that even if this pandemic is over, it has changed higher education probably forever. Because steps which we hesitantly made in the past, of course, have received more urgency now that we know that any moment, of course, the continuation of teaching or learning in a face-to-face situation can change. We go to the next slide. So I'll discuss four items: the future of higher education, that is changing anyway, the context of learning, teaching and assessment, the role of competences, also covered already partly by Leah, and achieving learning outcomes in COVID-19 times and beyond. And I relate my experience a little bit on a recent project we have done, Kalawi, which is still running, in which we actually try to define what future learning should look like. So we go to the next slide. So questions that come up, in particular brought up by the OECD, but also by other organizations: is there a future for higher education? Is there a future for higher education in terms of traditional education in a classroom environment? And if so, how does this future look like? So we have to deal with digital learning by definition. We have to deal with skills matching. We are told all the time, and very recent research confirms this again, that there is still this skills gap, and so the mismatching between the needs of society and what is learned in higher education. And of course, we have this new phenomenon, relatively new phenomenon, work-based learning, where we try to align to real life situations. So the key question which I want to start with is higher education meeting the needs of society? And then in that case, what are these needs and how do we know? Next slide. So already we have to deal in higher education with a number of issues. And here are some publications, recent publications about the future of higher education, where these challenges are outlined. And it's worth reading those. So we are in a quite different situation than we were 5 or 10 years ago. of course, we have to deal now with issues we weren't aware of so many years ago. And on top of all these issues, like global warming, etc., the multicultural society, we have now to deal with COVID-19. So what do we know and what should we know is a key question. Are we indeed learning the right things? Are we teaching the right things? Are we assessing the right things? Next one. So I don't have to convince you that technology is changing, and this was also very clear in the previous presentation. Society is changing very rapidly, and students, of course, have to become the focal point of higher education. Student-centered learning is now at the forefront of what we're trying to establish. So we require probably alternative modes of education that are developing anyway. Online learning, micro-credentials, a very hot topic, in particular, I dare to say, in the United States, also because of the effect of the costs which are related to higher education learning. But we also have to admit that traditional higher education has strengths compared to online learning. We're offering a social learning community, which is far less developed online, because you don't really meet people in person, or at least limited, allows for developing the general academic skills, generic competences, such as critical thinking, analyzing, synthesizing, writing, and oral communication in a learning environment. But is this sufficient? What are the lessons learned from COVID-19 in this respect? Next one. Well, what we have to deal with, of course, is the paradigm of learning. The paradigm of learning is changing, but we have to be very honest to each other. It's changing very slowly. Throughout Europe, research shows, but also the outcomes of the evaluations of the Bologna process show that we move slowly from input to output-based learning, student-centered learning, and competence-based learning. Where we do have agreement, of course, is that needs to have to be evidenced, and preferably in an international context. So our reference points are, of course, not institutional based or national based, are internationally based. So we define together what learning is relevant and what does high quality means. So nowadays, we have not a single challenge only to go to this new paradigm of learning. There is, of course, on top of the modernization, there's also the online format that comes into play. Next one. We have invested a lot of effort, of course, in defining what is the intended learning we are looking for. We have come up with descriptors, already also mentioned by Leah. We have developed overarching reference frameworks. We have developed academic domain reference frameworks. We have developed subject area disciplinary reference frameworks. And we also in Callaway now have developed assessment reference frameworks. They offer us the background for what learning should be. And what we discovered, what we discussed during the last year, is whether these frameworks which have been developed actually have to change with regard to what COVID-19 has learned us. And the conclusion is not really. So the references of learning will not change. There might be additional elements as a result of COVID-19. Online learning will play an more important role, but the reference of what should be learned has not changed, at least according to all these academic experts we have involved in our projects, have not changed with regard to the output of what we're looking for, indeed the learning outcomes of the different programs. And I think that's an important conclusion. So the standards, the reference are still there, and they're not challenged, also not as a result of what we have experienced in the last year. Next one. How do we know? In Callaway recently, and I think it's a tremendous step forward, we have combined the two existing frameworks in European higher education. We have combined the European qualifications framework for the European higher education area and combine it indeed with the EQF for lifelong learning. And as a result, you get a very powerful instrument to define what learning we are looking for. Next one. So you get this pyramid, which I more or less described already, of the different levels, which we think, and we didn't do this very well in the past, but we think should be clearly aligned to make clear what learning is looked for in a particular subject area in relation to higher levels of defining the descriptors. Next one. So the result was this figure, this image, in which we can see that as a result of the merging, we have now developed 3 levels of learning: the knowledge, the skills, and the autonomy and responsibility. And why do I show this? Because when you move to online learning, you get into trouble, at least you expect to get into trouble, with regard to let's say the dimensions, which are more skills and autonomy and responsibility related, or call it types of learning. In our view, skills is a higher level of learning than knowledge, and autonomy and responsibility, again, is a higher level of learning than skills and knowledge. We go to the next one. So we make a distinction between knowledge transfer and acquisition, apply knowledge by developing skills in an academic context, and applying knowledge and skills in the real world in terms of autonomy and responsibility. Can we learn this also, in particular the last 2, outside the traditional classroom? Next one. What we see, and this is one example of research that has been done, but there are many other examples. The future for higher education in general is not so much, although it has to be learned anyway, it's a traditional knowledge related to a particular field, but is most of all on soft skills. And this has everything to do with the flexibility of the labor market, everything to do with the flexibility of society. So lining up with the needs of society is quite crucial. And then you ask yourself, how will the workplace of tomorrow look like? And as a result of the experience of COVID-19, we know already that this workplace will change. Because learning at home, working at home, has tremendous advantages. There are no traffic jams anymore in the morning, because you can start working at home. You can go to the office still and leave early or leave late, whatever you do. It's very good for the green economy. So the productivity might be higher than in the traditional format. But of course, we haven't taught this way of working in the workplace in higher education. And COVID-19 has offered us a very good opportunity to make at least a start with this combination of online production and face-to-face production in the workplace. So in that sense, the learning outcomes have to be accommodated to this new situation. Next one. But the problem, of course, is that we have generic competences which seem not to be so easy to be developed in a context which is online. So if you take this list, besides digital literacy and academic writing and oral skills, there are all kinds of elements in which there's a challenge with regard to an online environment. Some easily can be matched to online, others probably less easy. For example, intercultural competences is very difficult to practice in real life situations when you are just behind a computer. Teamwork might still work, and teamwork might also work in terms of interdisciplinary and intercultural approach, but it's not quite the same. Leadership will have a different format. Conflict resolution will have a different format, project work as well. So we really have to adapt to a situation where this doesn't take place in a work placement and in a workplace. We go to the next one. So I already talked about the frames we made for Kalawi, and you see here examples of 5 disciplines, and we're working on another 5. But the next slide is more interesting. Here you see the descriptors for level 6 of one discipline, civil engineering. And these are descriptors which are broken down in assessment descriptors. And at the bottom of your screen, you see the assessment approaches and the learning approaches. And you can see that part of these, also for skills and autonomy and responsibility, can actually be learned in whatever context, whether it is a face-to-face or it is an online environment. For some, we have probably more difficulties, but to a large extent, there are ways out. It might not be perfect, but we can get very far in actually achieving the learning outcomes which have been set and which are in particular skills and wider competences, autonomy and responsibility related. We go to the next one. So we can meet them. Of course, we can't meet them in any way. If, for example, laboratory work is involved, that of course can't be replaced by theory. In some countries, it had to be done because there were no facilities, but it's far from ideal. So that probably can't change. But many other things can actually change. So we are talking already about work placements, which are a combination, hybrid, which are a combination of the workplace and online. And this is already taking place in reality. And as far as we can see, also in my own program, this offers very good results. But it requires an infrastructure, it requires a way of acting, also with regard to the company or the institution where a placement is set, which is different than the traditional one. Next one. Nevertheless, when we take these 3 dimensions which I've showed, knowledge, skills, and autonomy and responsibility into account, as Leah already said, if we are passing knowledge, if we transfer knowledge, if there's acquisition of knowledge, it's much more than a PowerPoint in a lecture course, which is made available online. Real interaction for learning is a requirement. Deep learning won't take place by just transferring knowledge. And we know this, of course, by experience. So meeting the learning outcomes that have been set require much more than just a lecture course. What I notice at the moment that in many institutions throughout Europe, people went not beyond that level as just passing PowerPoints online. So the interaction didn't always take place. And for good reasons, of course, students were very disappointed with regard to the quality of learning, and it was left to them to make progress instead of that the institution intervened. So if we have a model with regard to knowledge transfer, it has to probably be a combination of blended learning and online learning. And if it's online learning, it has to be small group learning in which interaction can take place. There should be a combination of formative tasks given to students and summative assessment. And the software, which we have available already, but which is not always owned, of course, by institutions or used by institutions, is there to help us. So in terms of the technology, I would say the solutions have already been found and new steps are already made, also in terms of assessment. And Kalawi is probably leading also in that respect. So we need tailored assignments to develop deeper and deep understanding. But we must be fair to each other. What we have learned over the last, let's say, 9 months, is that the staff effort to organize this learning is much higher, also in times, but also in efforts, intellectual efforts, than traditional learning, because we had to reinvent partly the wheel to meet the same learning outcomes we had to set for ourselves, or at least to come close to meeting those. Next one. So with regard to skills development, we can also use them in a blended online format. But central should be, again, a sort of seminar online format in which exercise courses, written oral assignments take place, where peer reviewing takes place online in this respect, because of the commenting on assignments that can be given. Sessions can be chaired by students, so leadership can be practiced, and teamwork in problem solving is also a very good alternative. And this can all be organized online. Not ideal, but still meeting to a very large extent the learning outcomes we have set for ourselves in relation to the generic competences we have identified as being important for the world of today and tomorrow. Next one. So autonomy and responsibility, the most ambitious level of learning. And I have to be fair here that what we found in Karlovy, that this level of learning is still not practiced in most institutions in Europe. So one might say, okay, we will compromise there. So we'll leave it out for the moment because it isn't taught and learned anyway at the moment. But of course, that is of course not intended student-centered learning, but it's also the case for online learning. And what we notice is that if institutions have made a start in this respect, they are doing much better. They are doing much better than when this experience didn't exist. So conditions, well-developed technological infrastructure. This is of course crucial, and Leah has explained this in detail. Trained academic and supporting staff. Student and staff engagement and with regard to interaction and active learning. So students really should believe in this format. Clear arrangements to meet the quality standards of TLA. So teaching, learning and assessment, and that's no different than in a traditional format. And aligned learning, teaching and assessment, respecting, taking into account, of course, by definition, the limitations of the blended online format. So it can be done. We have to compromise, and we partly had to reinvent the wheel. But programs who already had experience are, I think, doing rather well, although it's a challenge. And others, I think, have to catch up to meet indeed the learning outcomes which we have developed with each other, agreed with each other, that should be achieved in the program of today, but also in particular tomorrow. So, also my question, observations, remarks, and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. Yes, great. So first of all, I would like to thank you both for your contributions and ask our participants of our webinar if you have any questions. Please feel free to let us know using the chat. So you can ask the question using the chat function. If you would like to ask them directly, I think that we can accommodate that as well. Just let us know. Maybe I will start with a simple question, I think, and to both of you. In your experience, do you believe that any learning outcome is actually achievable through online delivery that just requires, as Robert uses, just a little bit different format, or some of the learning outcomes are just impossible to be achieved in the online delivery mode, and whenever quality assurance agency or higher education institution plans to use it or seize it, there should be like a red alert saying that, okay, this is not going to happen, so you should rethink if you want to use this learning outcome in your program. We can start with Leah.
Okay. I would say that online learning is not one size fits all for every kind of outcome. There are many programs that require hands-on practice to demonstrate competencies, especially in the health and medical fields, some engineering fields. And so distance education is most effective when it's truly appropriate for the delivery of the learning outcome. And it's up to the quality assurance agency and the experts in the field that they work with, you know, the trained evaluators that accompany you on kind of subject specialty areas, to tell you if this is really appropriate to be training future professionals in a certain field. There's a number of articles and studies written on this that I've come across over the years. And you know, I would just say to the quality assurance bodies out there, you know, rely on your subject specialists to tell you as they participate in your quality assurance process about whether or not this is accomplishing the learning outcomes based on the field of practice, the subject under study.
Great. Robert, what do you think about it?
Yes and no. I agree, of course, with Leah with regard to the health sector. And of course, we deal with this also in our project, in particular with nursing, but also with medicine. And at a certain moment, indeed, you have to see your patients, or you have to see patients, because practice, of course, that is your job anyway. But still, you can practice a lot before you actually, in a particular situation where we are now, COVID-19, because we wouldn't have chosen this approach if it wouldn't be there. And then we would still operating like we did in the past. But we have also to be realistic, also in the healthcare sector. We found, of course, that if we're talking about medication, for example, at identifying medication, the computer is doing better than a doctor. So also doctors already make much more use of, and also nurses make much more use, but the particular doctors, much more use of computers than they did in the past. That won't go away anymore. So the digitalization is a reality. Still, you have to see the patient, and of course, you still have to operate if the patient has to be operated. That's clear. If you build a bridge in engineering, or whatever form of engineering, of course, there is the practice that won't go away. But you can simulate a lot. We can simulate a lot. We can simulate also healthcare. We can also simulate engineering problems. And this will develop further, also by using algorithms. We have to be very realistic. This will be the future anyway. But of course, what can't be missed, at least in my view, is this social environment. People are social animals. And to be honest, we won't manage to keep going on like this. Of course, there's a lot of tension already. And the first 3 months we managed. But now the next 3 months in this semester, tensions are building up. People are starting to protest. They are not going to accept this anymore much longer. So in that sense, they need an environment again in which they can operate. And it's the same for learning. It's the same for teaching. It's the same for assessment. But what will be a reality, that the online, the blended format will become much stronger than it has in the past. So we have lost a lot, but probably we have also a winning element in this experience.
All right, thank you. So actually continuing this question, do you believe that if this form of delivery of like the online one should stay with us a bit longer, do you believe that actually higher education institutions that are more used to the traditional face-to-face delivery but want to keep the online format, do you believe that they actually should already start thinking about redesigning, or we should expect as a quality assurance agencies for higher education institutions to redesign their curricula, programs, or perhaps intended learning outcomes to accommodate this this new way of delivery? Shall we somehow ask the higher education institutions how do they intend to accommodate and adjust their programs to this mode of delivery if that will stay with us for longer? Leah?
I'll speak to how this is being handled in the United States.
All right, perfect.
The U.S. Department of Education back in May issued a guidance letter to all of the quality assurance bodies in the United States, allowing for flexibility in rapid transitions to online learning. In the United States, online learning requires specific approval from the quality assurance body. But the Department of Education allowed for institutions to offer distance education ahead of formal approval by the accreditor, and just kind of allowing this flexible time frame through December 31. But that's it. If institutions want to proceed beyond this kind of flexible time frame, they have to get it on board with their quality assurance body and make sure that all of the accreditation standards for delivering distance education are being met. As I said in my presentation, it's been 9 months. We're done with emergency response to this. Institutions have now had plenty of time to assess their resources and see where they want to invest in online learning or not. And again, the accreditor has a major role in affirming what the institution's going to do next.
All right, that's a very interesting point, I guess. Robert?
Yeah, to be very fair, there's no way out. We have to redesign our curricula, and not only because of, that's why I gave the context, not only because of COVID-19. What the real discussion is the 40 years curriculum. People are in the workplace for 40 years and they have to be reskilled over time. So lifelong learning will become a very important issue. Tim Birtwistle and I wrote an article about it, was even quoted at the Bologna Ministers Conference by our American colleague from Lumina. And there we make the argument that online learning is a reality anyway. Universities have to reinvent their place. They have to take into account flexibility much more than they do now. So in that sense, micro-credentials or electives will play a role in the future. But we also made the argument that people have to return to the university. And the university should become a mixture of new learners and, let's say, experienced learners, even in the same topic, because knowledge is changing, skills are changing very rapidly, and people need instructions over the coming 40 years. And there, all these elements will come together. And of course, online learning will never replace, in my view, at least I'm a firm believer of the universities and the social environment. But also, I'm very realistic that part of the learning can be replaced far better, more effectively by a blended format.
Right, great. I think that I would like to follow up one specific issue with Leah, actually, because you have mentioned that higher education providers in US are specifically requested to evaluate the students' access to appropriate equipment. Can you actually say a few words how that works in practice? Because I believe that since students are enrolling in distance education, they are not asked to bring their computer to to university and show this is my computer. How that works in practice, or what we can learn from that?
Sure. Well, let me just clarify one thing.
Yep.
It is not a universal standard in the United States.
All right.
To verify that. It is a DEAC, the organization that I operate. We have a standard about verifying the student having the technology they need to be successful. So we accomplish that in a couple of ways. Institutions offer a short kind of assessment for the student to complete to show that they have access to the technology. The student can show that they have the internet subscription, that they've performed some kinds of, practical exercises, if you will, in enrollment, accessing the learning management system. The admission staff can see that the student's unique identifier, has indeed accessed the technology platform on a regular and recurring basis. There's also the student's responsibility, to acknowledge that, yes, I have the technology required to complete this course. Yes, I can produce evidence of my, authenticating my work. And this is done using a lot of different technologies, whether, it's, software that has keystroke technology, knuckle recognition technology, video conferencing, showing your identification. It's a combination of factors: authenticating the student, authenticating their work, and verifying that they do indeed have the technology access and capabilities, to be successful in online learning. I think Robert had said, that, you know, about faculty having to kind of retool their abilities to teach because of this online learning modality. And so, you know, students bear some responsibility on their own to make sure that they have those capabilities to be successful while the institution is making its own efforts to work with and accommodate the student.
Right. Robert, would you like to comment on that? Do you think that this is something that we could accommodate and learn in the European perspective? Or we?
No, I think it's one of the elements that come on top, let's say, of the elements we are already using. So setting standards, for example, makes sense. But of course, this is very easy for relatively rich countries. I also deal with very poor countries. And I can assure you that education is dead completely. If you take the Philippines, for example, we are dealing with, there is no education at the moment because people have no access to computers, at least not the level which we require, because I'm talking about very advanced ways of teaching and learning on a computer. But then you need the software, you need a very good computer, which is actually to streamline, etc., etc. This is limited, I dare to say, to Europe and the United States most of all at the moment. And of course, that is a concern because it also means that we discriminate in this respect between parts of the world. But for sure, how can it work if the infrastructure is not up to standards? And how can it work successfully when the teachers are not prepared to operate in this format? And there I see, to be very honest, very large differences between countries. Some countries are doing much better than others. And I even dare to say that traditional philosophies of education, formats of education, make a difference here. So in institutions that have already an experience, for example, with more advanced formats of teaching and learning, are doing better in a online format than those who don't have this experience. And it has to do also with the flexibility, I think, of the mindset of the teaching and supporting staff, the administrative staff. So we have a way to, we have a war to win here, more or less.
I agree, Robert. You know, DEAC institutions enroll students from all over the world, and many students have had disruptions to their access, you know, to the internet. You know, the hurricane season was terrible. That disrupted many of our students in the Caribbean. So yeah, force of nature can really have a major impact on students to no fault of their own and to no fault of the university serving them.
I think that we are opening here quite a completely new aspect of student support and system offered by higher education institutions, or just the way how the higher education institutions deal with completely unpredictable situations when dealing with the students in an online mode. I think that we both, all of us at some point, believe that the online mode of delivery will actually enhance the global access to higher education. But from what I see, is it might actually be a little bit other way around when it comes to good quality of education, especially in the highly advanced programs like engineering and so whatsoever that requires high class technology and computers and so on. So right now we have, in our chat, we have a quite long question from Thomas, our colleague, and the question is to Leah. Does DAEC keep a publicly accessible register of accreditation of its decision? Is the online assessment tool the only for self-assessment, or it's also used to demonstrate the quality of online education?
Okay, so to the first question, yes, DEAC publishes its accreditation decisions on its website and also in the directory of institutions. So when you go to search institutions on our website, you can see a summary of the accreditation decision that is most recently made for each institution. There's also a public information page that summarizes each board decision meeting and all of the accreditation decisions by meeting is available to the public. The assessment test is not used by DEAC to evaluate quality. In fact, we don't really get to see the results when an institution goes in and takes that test. It's really meant for self-evaluation on the part of a distance education institution or program. You know, the results are private to them. So if a program representative, let's say, you know, a director of assessment of a distance ed program decides to go in and take that assessment tool, and if they're very honest in how they answer those questions about, you know, their effectiveness, then they'll get a report that they can use then to kind of gauge where they might want to improve, adjust resources, and that kind of a thing. And if they want to come to DEAC for further advice or accreditation, they're welcome to do so.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that from my side, if anyone would have any more questions, please feel free. We still have a couple of minutes. But I think that ask my final question to both of you about your, like, say, key advice or like main advice for higher education institutions, and of course in consequence to quality assurance agencies about the assessment of the learning outcomes. What the higher education institutions should especially pay attention and to in particular when regards to ethical issues, because Leah already mentioned that identification of the students and so on is important, and it's a challenge. But you know, as for now, we are all used to the traditional exam mode or delivery of the essays and whatsoever. But now since it's a bit of a challenge how to do that. What would be your advice for higher education institutions? What to specifically pay attention to?
Well, in the United States, this pandemic has wrecked financial stability across the spectrum of our economy, especially for institutions that rely on revenues in a highly decentralized manner. You know, in the United States, we don't have a national system of colleges. It's very spread out. There's 4,500 different private, public, for-profit universities. The pandemic has been deeply impactful to them financially because they're not receiving revenues for housing, for dining, for sports, for many things that they rely on to operate their academics. And so quality assurance has really had to strike a balance in making its reviews and in making its decisions about accreditation and about quality, to try to be flexible and understanding during this time. I think my advice to institutions is to communicate as clearly and as compellingly as possible with the quality assurance body about your situation. You know, I spoke a lot today about investing in the technology enterprise, you know, making sure that faculty are trained. That costs money. And those are resources that many institutions in the United States right now just don't have. And so trying to strike a balance to make what you have available work to the fullest capacity it can, and keeping a record of that and explaining it to the accrediting body is going to be vitally important going into the next year.
Okay, Robert, what would be your advice?
Now, if I would take the position of accreditation agency, I would ask for evidence, also in a new situation again. Mm-hmm. So how does your assessment take place? How is it organized? Have you made changes? Why did you make changes to meet those ambitious, and also be ask questions which require an honest answer? Did you have to compromise somewhere? With regard to the ethical question, I think there's enough software which allows you to control students even if there is a traditional exam. At least that's what software providers tell me. But is that the alternative? We don't want these summative assessments in a traditional format anyway. Of course, they have to be done probably in the third year to build up knowledge. But further on in the program, we should really go to student-centered learning, which means a completely different type of assignments. And these assignments, in all reality, are not controlled every day, not in the present situation and not in an online situation. It doesn't really matter. If you write a paper, you write it yourself. And of course, you have to show the paper trace how you came to certain conclusions. If you work together in a team, whether this is online or it's face-to-face, it has to be checked anyway. So in that respect, there are many, many possibilities to guarantee, but you have to take it very seriously. You have to guarantee quality. Quality has to be taken very seriously, but it's up to the institution, it's up to the academics, it's up to the supporting staff to evidence to quality assurance agency that they're still able to meet, at least have the ambition, although they might sometimes have to compromise, in particular in healthcare, for example, or take more time, or we have to wait before the solutions can be found, because we are going to normal practice. But evidence here, again, has not changed. It was in the past the case, it will be in the future the case. And it has to be the case anyway, because as I said, we will change the environment of higher education anyway.
Okay, great. Since I don't see any further questions on the chat, I think that we will be moving. Oh, there's one. Social competences seem to be off the table for the time being, but the future of university society should look grim without them. That's a really well.
Yeah, that's why I fully agree. That's why we need the social environment.
Yeah. And
people are longing to go back to the university and to meet people again, and we are social animals in the end. So in that respect, so I don't believe in MOOCs only, so to say. It has to be a sort of combination.
Great. Okay, so I think that we will be moving to conclusions. Before I will thank you all and close it, perhaps there are a few closing words that you would like to say to the participants, like a final thought from both of you. Leah, if there is anything that you would like to.
Quality assurance and accreditation is a close community. And in the United States, we really appreciate working with our international partners. Please feel free to use the DEAC website as a resource for distance education assessment. We're happy to support you if you're looking for training for evaluators within your accrediting organizations. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I've been doing a lot of interactions with quality assurance bodies in the Middle East, in Thailand, in Japan, and Australia. I'm involved with INQUAHE, which is the International Network for Quality Assurance Agencies in Higher Education. So please reach out. If there's anything we can do to assist and support you, just let us know. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this meeting today.
Thank you. Robert?
Yeah, in the European context, I think you have a role to play. Yeah, I think you have to reach out as organizations to the higher education institutions to see how they managed and to identify the challenges. And this seminar, of course, is a good initiative, but you reach each other, you don't reach the institutions. I would start discussing with the institutions what it has meant for them to have these challenges, and also to organize it in such a way that we can learn, particularly with regard to your organization, how we can learn in an international perspective what worked and what didn't work. So as a sort of intermediate. Because as I said, some institutions have been much more successful, some countries have been much more successful than others. So in that sense, we should learn from each other. And also, I suppose, learning from the United States, because models, already a lot of models all over the world are in place, which are a sort of alternative for the challenges we have met.
Great. Thank you very much. And it was a great pleasure to having you here. And I hope that we will continue our discussions in the future. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your presentations. Thank the participants for being with us, for taking part in our discussion. And I truly hope that you will join our future ECA events. And we'll continue this and further more topics. So thank you again, and enjoy your afternoon. And I think that enjoy your day when it comes to Leah. Is it? Great. So have a great day, and goodbye. Bye-bye.